Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I like to discuss what you might describe as Keir Starmer's first emergency as Prime Minister, not counting the ones left over or even deliberately created by the previous government. Starmer held a press conference in which he laid out what the government would be doing in response to the far-right attacks over the past 2 days. I'd like to just run down the key points in what he's doing to support action to prevent further occurrences and what gaps there were in the responses as well. I mean, the first few things to note was, first of all, there was an emergency and the government have immediately called a meeting bringing together senior police officers and others from around the country to go, what do we need to do to support you? And they've said, well, we'd like you to do this, Prime Minister. And now the Prime Minister's come out, done a press conference and says, well, we're going to do this to support them. So that's quite new. But the other thing to consider, there were a couple of points which Starmer repeated during the press conference. The first is that these attacks were coordinated by the far right. No messing about. They were coordinated. They were not organised by people from the affected communities. And they were representing the far right. No equivocation there. The second point he made was that he and everyone should really begin their response in terms of the victims and the families of the victims. He made the point quite a few times that claiming to be committing these criminal acts in the names of victims and families is not actually representing their wishes. And if you're shooting your mouth off from the sidelines in a way that's not helpful, you're not representing their interests. Because he was saying in a criminal case, the suggestion here was the case can collapse. And then the victims and families are denied justice. If you do or say anything that prejudices the trial, you cannot convict someone if they have been denied access to a fair trial. So that is his point is that's the price for shooting your mouth off. In terms of the practical response, the situation facing the government was essentially that multiple coordinated attacks had taken place. Further ones could be planned. The people involved move around the country and police forces who are sort of located regionally need to be coordinated and be able to pool intelligence in order to deal with that very mobile threat. So making sure that happens was the first of the practical announcements today. The second was about applying travel restrictions to the people convicted of these offences in the same way as Starmer said we already do with convicted football hooligans. So we already have that system in place for football hooligans. The idea is because these thugs are travelling from elsewhere in the country and then meeting up wherever they want to kick the crap out of some part of our country, on buses and trains, just as football hooligans have attempted to in the past, using the same technology and the same criminal behaviour orders, restricts their movements, makes these large gatherings, which then overwhelm the police, less likely. Starmer was asked about levels of policing. It was told, for example, that in Hartlepool the police were just overwhelmed. And they were asked, recruitment. What about recruitment then? Making sure they've got more police. So Starmer did point out they'd already promised more recruitment, but that doesn't solve this problem because recruitment, that takes time. We're talking about making sure that more of these attacks can't happen in the next few weeks. So he made the point that what you need to do is to be able to deal with it in the here and now with the resources we've got, with the police officers we've got. And we need to be making sure we're ready for any further attempts at violence in literally the next couple of weeks, maybe tomorrow. That's not a time frame recruitment can do anything about. When it comes to dealing with the elephant in the room, and that is moving away from those who carry out the attacks to those who spread the disinformation and those who incited the violence, the media and social media personalities essentially who whipped this up, the response was a little bit more uncertain. Starmer did make the point that acts like this are criminal offences already. There were a few questions from journalists who sort of probed it a little bit, but unfortunately none of them really asked the direct question. Do you expect those who provably spread disinformation, which is a criminal offence, to be investigated and charged? Now, he might have been cagey on such a question. We don't know because he was never asked it in direct terms. So all we got was that in theory, some of those who were spreading the lies or inciting the violence online could be investigated and charged. But we don't know if the government expects that. Not that the government has any influence over investigations or prosecutions, just to be clear, and they absolutely should not. But I would have liked to have known what the government thinks about what should happen or what the public would expect to happen. Because Starmer was really clear that those directly involved in the violence should be investigated and charged. That was unequivocal. What I don't know is what he thinks about those who shot their mouths off with obvious lies and incitement on social media, other than that he said, well, this is a criminal offence. And it's just a very, very weak implication that therefore there could be a criminal investigation. In terms of social media companies, he was a little bit clearer. He talked about the responsibility they have to make sure misinformation is dealt with on their platforms. He basically said crimes are being committed in your house. He said, you know, some of the things that were posted online were not a matter of free speech. They were criminal offences. He also said there would be a response in terms of working with social media platforms to act responsibly. But as he said, that's a conversation for later. He's not going to come out with a straight answer here. My issue is we know that Musk and Twitter are loose cannons in this arena, and they're not going to respond to any appeal to common decency. But for my money, it's difficult for the government to really bring an insane private owner of an insane private social media platform to heel. Not impossible, but very, very difficult and very time consuming. But as a country, it's much easier to make sure that the people who use the platform in this country face criminal responsibility for committing what Starmer has clearly said were criminal offences. I just don't get the impression he wanted to really say at this point. He had the opportunity, journalists had the opportunity to ask the question in such a way as to force him to either answer clearly or evade, as he did when asked specifically about Nigel Farage, except I wouldn't criticise this. So he was asked by at least a couple of the journalists, what about Nigel Farage? You know, there's a former police officer saying Nigel Farage incited this. Blah, blah, blah. Starmer did say he wasn't going to get into what any individuals had to say. But that's not being politically evasive. Because were there to be a criminal investigation brought against Nigel Farage, I'm not expecting it, but let's just say, it could just be argued that having the Prime Minister shooting his mouth off about him may just prejudice the case. And remember what he was saying about those who shoot their mouths off about criminal investigations. You can prejudice any trial and therefore justice doesn't happen. So I'm not going to give any politician grief for evading questions about individuals who might at some point be involved in criminal proceedings, because the right to a fair trial requires that actually can you keep your mouth shut on matters like that. But I would have liked to hear whether he thought in general terms, without referring or even hinting at any individuals, in general terms, people who spread the lies and incited the violence should face the same full force of the law that he clearly said the thugs on the street should face. Also worth noting that due to the nature of the knuckle draggers involved and the lies told, Muslim communities were specifically targeted, with a mosque in both Southport and Hartlepool attacked at least. Because that is worth bearing in mind. When we talk about they threw bricks at the police and they kicked people's walls in. These were attacks on communities. But in Southport and Hartlepool, at least, they specifically went there to attack a mosque, right? Because we know who these people are. Starmer made this point in his opening statement before any questions, so he put the emphasis on that as well, in order to emphasise the real target of the rioters. And he also made it clear these weren't protests. He didn't use the word riot himself, but he did say these were not protests, they weren't demonstrations, they were criminal acts, they were preconceived criminal acts. But he was asked specifically about the Muslim community and said he'd do everything he can to keep them safe. I know there's going to be heightened concern ahead of Friday prayers tomorrow. So that was the meat of what came out of the press conference from my point of view. So, I mean, what Starmer's done here is he's acted decisively. There's been an emergency. He's immediately organised an emergency meeting of people who need to deal with it, police. In terms of what he could do as head of government, he is doing. Because for me, the real test will be a bit later. If what he's doing to support the police and justice system now doesn't quite do the job in itself, will there be further action? Starmer did say he wants to wean the government off this idea of just handing over more police powers when something like this happens, which I think will be a relief to all of us after the last government. And also he said, you don't need to keep legislating when we've got perfectly good legislation already there. I imagine that will come as a relief to some barristers that I follow, who always sigh a weary sigh. Whenever there's some big thing in the news, the government always seems to feel, oh, what we need is tough new legislation. And it's like, yeah, sometimes I've said myself, if the existing legislation doesn't get the desired outcome, yeah, you need to look at it. But sometimes it's already fine. Starmer said, he made the point, he's not about performative politics. He's not coming out there going, oh yeah, don't worry, I'm going to sort it all out single-handedly. We've had that in the past. Something like this happens, the government feel, because the country's looking to them, they feel that they have to do something to deal with it. So what do they have? Oh, tough new measures. In reality, no. The police, the CPS and the courts deal with this. What we need the government to do is make sure they have got the resources to do it. So from my point of view, Starmer has taken the situation seriously. He's met with senior officers quickly. He's explained to the nation what he's doing immediately. And, he's providing the police, as far as we can tell, with the tools that they have required. And beyond that, he's not making himself look like he's the one in the mix. He's the one sorting it all out personally. Policing issue, it's just his job to make sure they've got the ability to deal with it. But I'd like to see what happens if those who are committing criminal offences online, by providing the excuses for the knuckle draggers, end up not being investigated. Because surely the public expect everyone responsible, even those from a safe distance, to face the consequences of their deliberate actions. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe for further content and click the like button. You can also sign up for memberships if you'd like to support the channel further. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'll see you later.